My name is Cassidy Renee Ullman. I am 26 years old. I want to tell you something before I get into any of this because I think it matters. I am not someone who cries easily. I grew up in Flagstaff, Arizona, where the altitude makes everything harder: your lungs, your legs, your mood on bad training days, and my mother used to say that the thin air burned the softness out of people early. I believed her. I believed it every morning at 5 a.m. When I laced up my running shoes in the dark and headed for the track, my breath a small white cloud in front of me, my body still half asleep but my legs already knowing what to do. I am telling you this because what I'm about to describe is the kind of thing that could make a person very bitter. And I want you to know that bitterness was never my goal. What I wanted, what I had always wanted. From the time I was 9 years old and watched a woman named Dina Castor run through the streets of Athens on a fuzzy television screen in my grandmother's living room, was to run. Just to run and to be the best at it, and to stand on a track somewhere in the world with a number pinned to my chest and know that I had earned every single second I was there. That's all I ever wanted. I grew up the youngest of 3 kids. My father, Dale Ullman, worked for the Forest Service and smelled permanently of pine resin and sunscreen. My mother, Patricia, taught 4th grade at Killip Elementary for 22 years and coached the school's junior joggers club on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, which is where, technically, my running career began. I was 7 when she first put me in the club. I was 9 when I beat every girl in my age group at the Northern Arizona Invitational by 45 seconds. I was 11 when a man named Gerald Coach G. Whitmore, who ran the Flagstaff Elite Track Club out of the NAU Athletics Complex, watched me run a 4:52 mile at a middle school meet and pulled my mother aside afterward and said, quietly and without any fuss, "Mrs. Ullman, your daughter is not normal." He meant it as a compliment. We took it as one. Coach G was 53 years old when he first started coaching me. He had gray temples and a thick silver mustache, and wore the same Navy Flagstaff Elite windbreaker every single day regardless of weather. He had coached 2 Olympians in his career, a hurdler named Marcus Webb who made the 2004 team and a middle-distance runner named Terry Plunkett who finished 6th in the 1500 meters in Beijing, and he had a quiet, methodical way of building athletes that I came to understand over many years was actually a kind of genius. He didn't yell, he didn't motivate with speeches. He communicated in short sentences and long silences, and he kept a yellow legal pad where he wrote down every split, every workout, every small observation about form or fatigue or mental state. And he referred back to those notes the way a doctor refers to a patient's chart. He believed in me completely. That's the part that makes everything else so hard to talk about. For 15 years, Gerald Whitmore was the most important person in my athletic life. He coached me through high school, where I won 4 consecutive state championships in the 1500 and 3000 meters. He coached me through my years at the University of Arizona, where I ran under the Wildcats program but still consulted with him regularly. Driving the 2 hours back to Flagstaff on off weekends to work through form corrections and race strategy. He was there when I ran a 4:04 1500 at the Stanford Invitational my senior year, a time that put me legitimately in the conversation for national-level competition. He was there when I signed with the Flagstaff Elite Post-Collegiate Program, which he ran, and which had received a small but meaningful grant from USA Track and Field to develop elite middle-distance talent. He sat across from me at a diner table when I was 22 years old and laid out a 4-year plan, handwritten on a fresh yellow legal pad page, with the words 2028 Los Angeles Olympic Trials circled at the top in blue ballpoint pen. "This is achievable," he said, "not guaranteed achievable. There's a difference." "I know," I said. "Do you?" He looked at me with those steady gray eyes. "Because achievable means you have to do things most people won't do for 4 years without a break." "I know," I said again, and I meant it. I moved back to Flagstaff after graduation. I took a part-time job at the Flagstaff Athletic Club, teaching group fitness classes 3 mornings a week. enough to cover my rent on a small apartment on Cedar Avenue and leave my afternoons free for training. I lived simply and deliberately. I meal prepped on Sundays. I was in bed by 9:30 most nights. I didn't drink at my friends' weddings. I tracked my sleep with a monitor strapped to my wrist and sent the data to Coach G every Monday. I had a foam roller I used for 45 minutes every evening, and a specific stretching sequence that I never skipped, not once, not even on Christmas morning. My college roommate, Becca, who I still talk to regularly and who lived in Scottsdale and worked in marketing, used to call me the monk affectionately and ask if I ever thought about, just having a normal life. After LA, I'd tell her, "You always say that, because it's always true, my life was the track." The altitude, the Red Rock training routes outside the city, the indoor sessions at the NAU facility where the sound of my spikes on the surface was a metronome I could feel in my back teeth. I loved it. I want to make sure that's clear because sometimes when people tell stories like this one, they make it sound like the sport was a burden, like they were trapped. I was not trapped. I chose this every single morning with full knowledge of what I was giving up. I chose it because when I ran, really ran, in a race with people on either side of me and a clock counting down, I felt more like myself than I ever did anywhere else. By the time I was 24, I was running 4:01s in the 1500. I had a USATF ranking inside the top 20 in my event. I'd competed at 2 national indoor championships and made the final at one of them. I was on the radar. Not a lock for the trials team, nothing in track is ever a lock, but genuinely, measurably on the path that Coach G had drawn up for me on that yellow legal pad. And then about 18 months ago, a person entered my life who would change everything. Her name was Sienna Whitmore, Coach G's daughter. I had known that Coach G had a daughter, in the abstract way that you know facts about someone without them ever being made real. He mentioned her occasionally. She'd played soccer in high school, she'd gone to Arizona State, she'd struggled some after college. He didn't elaborate. He was a private man I never pushed. In all my years working with him, I had met his wife Loretta maybe 4 or 5 times, always briefly, at track meets where she'd come to watch. She was a quiet, pleasant woman who brought a folding chair and a thermos of coffee, and seemed to exist in the pleasant background of Coach G's life. Sienna Whitmore appeared at the Flagstaff Elite Training Facility on a Wednesday afternoon in late October, 2 years before the Olympic trials. I was finishing a cool-down lap when I saw her standing at the edge of the track talking to Coach G. She was 23, taller than me by a couple of inches, with her father's gray-green eyes and dark hair pulled back under a baseball cap. She was lean the way runners are lean, and she moved on the balls of her feet, and when Coach G introduced her to me, he said, "You know my daughter Sienna. She's going to be training with us for a while." "I didn't know you were a runner," I said. She smiled. It was a careful smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes right away. I took some time off. "I'm getting back into it." "What event?" 1500, she said. I remember noticing in a split-second, purely instinctual way that Coach G did not look at me when she said this. He was looking at his yellow legal pad. I didn't make anything of it, not that day. I was not the kind of person who made things of nothing. There were always other athletes at the facility. The Flagstaff Elite program supported 8 or 10 post-collegiate runners at any given time. In various events, and it was not unusual for someone new to come in and train. I welcomed her. I showed her the locker room. I told her about the best recovery spots on the trail routes in which treadmills in the corner had the smoothest belts. I was kind to her because being kind costs nothing, and also because I genuinely believed, at that point, that she was just a woman trying to get back into a sport she had stepped away from. That belief lasted about 6 weeks. It was Darren who first said something out loud, and even then he framed it carefully, the way you frame things when you're not sure you're right. Darren Leach was another Flagstaff elite athlete, a steeplechaser from Tennessee who had come to Flagstaff for the altitude and stayed for 5 years. He was 30, even-tempered, deeply practical, and he had been around the program long enough to understand its rhythms. We were doing a recovery run on a Sunday morning, an easy 8 miles on the Buffalo Park Trail, when he said without preamble, "Have you looked at Sienna's workout log?" "Not really," I said. "Why, she's running 1,500 workouts." "So am I." "No," he paused, which with Darren was meaningful. "She's running your 1,500 workouts. The same phase periodization, the same interval progressions." I looked at the board. I thought about this. Coach G kept a whiteboard in the facility office where he posted weekly training plans for each athlete. The workouts were tailored. He had always been very specific about individualizing training based on each runner's fitness level and goals. "Maybe he's adapting her plan to match mine for simplicity," I said. Darren looked at me sideways. "She's doing your race-specific sessions, Cass. The 600-meter repeats at goal 1,500 pace. That's trials prep work. She's only been here 6 weeks. She hasn't run a competitive race in I don't even know how long." "I know," Darren said. "That's what's strange." I ran the rest of the miles quietly, turning it over. I told myself there was an explanation. There were always explanations for things that seemed strange at first. People do the same workouts for different reasons. Coach G knew what he was doing. He had always known what he was doing, but I started paying closer attention after that. December in Flagstaff is cold and clear, and the mountains wear their snow like something formal, something deliberate. I love the city in winter. The air is so dry it crackles, and the sunsets go pink and orange over the San Francisco peaks, and the Christmas lights on Route 66 downtown seem to glow extra bright against all that darkness. I grew up here. The landscape is part of my body, the same way running is part of my body. I know every crack in the track, every dip in the trail, every headwind that comes off Humphreys Peak at 7 a.m. in January. I started keeping notes, not because I thought I would need them. Because keeping notes is how I process things. I've always been that way. I kept a training journal for years, a spiral-bound thing where I wrote down splits and weather and how my legs felt and what I ate. And it had gradually expanded to include things that weren't strictly about running. Observations, conversations, things that seemed worth recording. December 4th, Sienna given the lane 2 spot for the time trial. I was told to run in lane 4. When I asked Coach G why, he said it was about flow of the session. I let it go. December 9th, Coach G gave Sienna a new pair of Hoka Silo X1 spikes. They retail for $280. He told me the program had limited equipment budget this quarter when I asked about new shoes in November. December 12th, Coach G adjusted my Wednesday lactate threshold workout from 5x1200 to 4x1200, citing accumulated fatigue. He did not adjust Sienna's. Her log still shows 5 reps. December 18th, Coach G spent 40 minutes on the infield working on Sienna's kick form after practice. He spent 12 minutes with me. I counted. I know how this sounds. I'm not proud that I was counting, but I was counting. I read back over these entries one evening in late December and felt something cold settle in my stomach. Not anger, not yet. Something more complicated, a mix of confusion and grief, because Coach G was not a stranger. He was 15 years of my life. He knew my running better than I knew it myself. He had helped build me into what I was. I didn't want to be the kind of athlete who complained about favoritism. Elite sport is full of people who mistake hard coaching for unfair treatment, and I had watched peers throw away good coaching relationships by being too proud or too sensitive. I had always prided myself on being neither, but there was a specific moment in early January that made it impossible to keep explaining things away. It was a Tuesday, a fast workout day, and Coach G had designed a session he called race simulation, essentially a 1,200-meter time trial at full effort. Designed to give him a baseline number to work from as we moved into the indoor season. These sessions were taken seriously. They were the data points the whole training cycle was built around. I ran 3:36.2. That is a 1,200 time that extrapolated projects to roughly a 4:00:1500. That is a very good time. That is, by any objective measure, a time that belongs to someone who has a legitimate shot at the Olympic trials standard. Sienna ran 3:47.8. That is also a respectable time for someone who had been back in training for only 10 weeks, but it is 11.5 seconds slower than mine. In track, 11.5 seconds is not a rounding error. In a 1200-meter time trial, it is an enormous gap. Coach G's post-session notes, which he shared with the group, devoted 3 paragraphs to Sienna's performance and 2 sentences to mine. I read those notes standing in the parking lot of the NAU facility in the cold January air, and something in me that had been very patient for a long time began, quietly, to run out. I want to tell you about the trip to the Phoenix Invitational in February, because that's when things escalated from something I could rationalize into something I could not. The Phoenix Invitational is a small indoor meet, nothing glamorous, just a regional USATF-sanctioned event that serious post-collegiate runners use for early season benchmarking. It has a 200-meter banked track and OK lighting and a concession stand that sells surprisingly good green chili breakfast burritos. I'd raced there 3 times before. It was familiar, manageable territory. Coach G entered 3 of us from the program, me, Sienna, and a third athlete named Priya Mehta, who ran the mile and had nothing to do with any of this. The 1500 was scheduled for Saturday afternoon. On Friday night, we had a team dinner at a Tex-Mex place in Tempe, and over chips and salsa, Coach G laid out the race plan. He talked about positioning, about the anticipated pace of the heat, about who to watch in the other lanes. He had printed a sheet. He always printed sheets. It was very him with the race breakdown. The sheet had 2 names on it, Sienna Whitmore and Cassidy Ullman. But the race instructions were not equal. Mine said, patient through 800, move at 1100, maintain. Sienna's said, go with Ullman through 800, draft, move at 1000. Win the race. I read this 3 times. Then I folded the sheet carefully and put it in my jacket pocket and smiled and said the right things through the rest of dinner. I am good at that. 15 years of competitive athletics teaches you to compartmentalize, to hold things in a box until the moment when you can actually do something with them. In the race itself, and I want you to understand that I am not making excuses. I never make excuses. I ran a 4:053. It was not my best race. It was not my worst. The pace was honest and I hit my splits, and in the final 200 I had more left than I expected and I probably should have gone earlier. Sienna ran a 4:081. I won the heat. She finished 3rd. Coach G did not congratulate me at the finish line. He jogged over to Sienna and talked to her quietly for several minutes while I walked my cooldown alone along the infield rail. Priya found me on my 3rd cooldown lap and fell into step beside me and said very quietly, I see it too, for what it's worth. See what? I said. She gave me a look. You know what? We didn't discuss it further, but the fact that Priya saw it without me saying a word, that lodged somewhere in my chest and did not move. On the drive back to Flagstaff that evening, Sienna rode in the front seat of Coach G's truck. I followed in my own car. The highway north cuts through desert scrub and then rises into the ponderosa pines around Mayer and Cords Junction. And I drove that familiar road in the February dark and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Afraid. Not of a race, not of failure in any physical sense. Afraid of what I was starting to understand. That the man who had spent 15 years building me might be in the process of replacing me. Not because I wasn't good enough, but because of whose last name she carried. March came. The spring outdoor season began. Coach G submitted our training group's entry list for the MT. SAC Relays, a major Southern California meet that draws serious national-level competition and is considered a legitimate proving ground for Olympic hopeful athletes. Getting into MT. SAC is meaningful. The invitations are not automatic. He submitted 1 name in the women's 1500. It was not mine. I found out because Darren saw the submission form on the printer. He brought it to me without a word and set it on the weight room bench beside me and walked away. I sat there with that piece of paper in my hands for a long time. The form was straightforward: name, event, coach certification. Under athlete name it said Sienna Whitmore. I had run MT, SAC the previous 2 years. I was currently ranked higher in the event than Sienna by 47 places. I was running faster times. I had a better competitive record, a more consistent injury history, and by any objective performance metric, I was the athlete who belonged in that meet. I drove to the facility the next morning 40 minutes before my scheduled workout and knocked on Coach G's office door. He looked up from his desk. He didn't seem surprised to see me. I saw the MT. SAC form, I said. I kept my voice level. That was something I had decided in the car. Whatever happened, I would keep my voice level. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, I think Sienna is ready for that level of competition. I think it'll be good for her development. What about my development? You're further along, you don't need MT. SAC the same way she does. I felt something crack very quietly in the center of my chest. Coach G. I'm ranked 47 places higher than she is. Rankings aren't everything. In Olympic qualification, they actually are, I said. That's literally the mechanism. He shifted in his chair. He picked up a pen and put it down. Cassidy, I have built your career very carefully. I know where you are. I'm asking you to trust me. 15 years of trusting him. I'm asking you to explain the MT SAC decision, I said. I explained it. You gave me a reason, you didn't explain it. The silence that followed was the kind that changes things. He looked at his desk, I looked at him. And in that moment, watching him not meet my eyes, I understood fully finally. Without any room left for rationalization, that something was happening that I had not consented to and could not training journal my way through. I thanked him for his time, which I know sounds strange but was the only thing I could think of to say. I went to the track and ran my workout. I ran it hard. I ran it like someone who needed to put the feeling somewhere physical before it became something she couldn't manage. That evening, I opened a new document on my laptop. At the top I typed, Documentation Log, Ullman versus Whitmore Program Disparity, and I began writing down everything I remembered in chronological order with as much specificity as I could. I was not ready to do anything with it yet. I didn't know what to do with it, but I was going to be ready. April brought the spring warmth and the dogwoods blooming in the median strips downtown and the smell of fresh-cut grass on the NAU campus. And with it came the announcement that changed the stakes entirely. USA Track and Field released the official qualification and selection criteria document for the 2028 Los Angeles Olympic Trials. It was 43 pages long and I read all of it. Twice. The key provision for the women's 1500 was straightforward. The top 3 finishers at the trials, provided they had achieved the World Athletics qualifying standard of 4:02:50, would be nominated for the Olympic team. There was also a provision, a smaller one buried in Section 4. Subsection C, that allowed the national governing body to grant a discretionary entry to the trials to athletes who had demonstrated extraordinary performance trajectory and coach certification of readiness, even if they had not yet achieved the time standard. It was a provision designed for late-blooming athletes. It had been used 4 times in the past decade, mostly for young teenagers who were improving rapidly. And it was, I realized, reading that language very carefully, exactly the kind of provision that a coach with authority, connections, and a daughter could exploit. I called Becca that night. I told her everything. When I finished, there was a long silence. Cass, she said finally, I think you need to talk to someone who knows this system. I know, I said, like a lawyer. Or an athlete advocate. I know, I said again. Outside my window on Cedar Avenue, the Flagstaff night was very quiet and very dark, and the stars were out the way they get out in Arizona, extravagant and indifferent. I had spent my whole life underneath those stars, waking up early, going to bed early, making every sacrifice the sport asked of me. I had given 15 years to a man I trusted completely. I was 26 years old. The trials were 18 months away. I was not going to let this go. The lawyer's name was Marguerite Flores, and she worked out of a small office on Larue Street in downtown Flagstaff, in a building that had been a hardware store in a previous life and still had exposed brick walls and slightly uneven floors. She specialized in employment and contract law. But she had handled 2 previous cases involving amateur athletics governance, and she came recommended by a USATF athlete representative I'd contacted through the national organization's athlete services portal. I walked into her office on a Thursday morning in late April carrying a manila folder that contained 31 pages of printed documentation, my training log comparisons, the MT. SAC submission form, the post-race notes from Phoenix, a timeline of incidents going back to October, and 3 photographs I had taken of the training facility whiteboard on separate occasions showing the differential in workout assignments. Marguerite Flores was 51, compact, direct, with reading glasses she wore on the end of her nose and took off when she was making a point. She read through my folder without speaking. It took about 20 minutes. I sat across from her and drank the coffee her assistant had brought and tried to look calmer than I felt. When she finished, she set the folder down and looked at me over her glasses. "Tell me about the contractual relationship," she said. "What did you sign when you joined the Flagstaff Elite program?" I explained. "A 1-year renewable athlete agreement that outlined training services, competition representation, and program resources. It had been renewed annually for 4 years. There was a clause about competitive opportunity, vague now that I thought about it. Something about the coach providing reasonable access to competitive development appropriate to the athlete's level. Reasonable access," she repeated. "And you have no legal recourse regarding which meets he enters you in?" "Not direct recourse, no. He has discretion over that." "What about the USATF grant?" I told her about the program grant, the funding that the Flagstaff Elite program had received from USA Track and Field to support post-collegiate middle-distance development. The grant, as I understood it, was tied to athlete performance outcomes. Programs receiving development grants were expected to demonstrate that the funding was being used to advance athletes who were legitimately on a development trajectory toward national competition. Marguerite took her glasses off. "So the program is receiving federal sports development funding," she said. "And the question is whether those resources are being equitably applied based on performance merit. That's one way to put it. It's the operative way to put it legally." She made a note. "How much do you know about what Sienna Whitmore's trajectory looked like before she came back to training?" "Not much," I admitted. "She went to Arizona State, she ran track there." She stopped. "Coach G mentioned she had a hard time after college. He never gave me details." "Did she compete for ASU?" "I assumed so, but I don't actually know." Marguerite wrote something else on her notepad. Then she looked up at me. "Here's what I want you to understand. What you have right now is a strong case of something. It might be a breach of equitable program administration. It might be misuse of the USATF grant. It might rise to the level of a formal complaint to the national governing body. What it isn't yet is airtight." She leaned forward. "You cannot confront him." "Not yet. You need more." "I know. I mean this seriously, Cassidy. If you confront him now, he knows you're building a case. He adjusts. He creates a paper trail that's favorable to him. These things, and I've seen this before in other sports governance situations, these things only work if the person you're documenting doesn't know they're being documented." "I understand. Let them play their hand," she said. "The more they do, the stronger your position becomes." She settled back in her chair. "I also want you to look into Sienna's competitive history more thoroughly. Public records, race results are public, collegiate athletic records are public. I want to know who she actually is as an athlete before October. Before her father started building her case." I drove home along the 180 past the peaks through the pine forest, and I felt something strange, not exactly calm, but focused. The way I felt before a race when the warm-up was done and the nerves had settled into something usable. I had a plan. I had someone in my corner. I was going to do this right. Darren had a contact at Arizona State. His name was Kyle something, a former steeplechaser who was now an assistant coach in the ASU track and field program, and Darren had maintained the kind of loose, friendly sports network connection that you build over years of competing on the national circuit. He didn't ask Kyle for anything sensitive. Just mentioned casually in a text exchange about something unrelated that Sienna Whitmore, Coach G's kid, you remember her. She ran there, right? Had come back into the sport and was training with them in Flagstaff. Kyle's response, which Darren forwarded to me with no commentary other than a raised eyebrow emoji, was illuminating. Sienna, yeah, she was with us for 2 years. She quit halfway through her junior season, had some personal stuff going on. She wasn't a 1500 runner, though she ran the 800. Decent but not elite. I didn't know she switched events. The 800 meters and the 1500 meters are related events, both middle distance, both require strong aerobic development, but they are not the same race. The physiological demands are different. The strategic demands are different. The time standards for Olympic qualification are different. Moving from the 800 to the 1500 as a post-collegiate athlete returning from a break is not impossible, but it is unusual, and it is not the kind of thing you do on a whim. It is the kind of thing you do because someone is building a case for a specific goal. I sat with that information for 2 days, turning it over. Then I went to the public results database. USA Track and Field maintains a publicly searchable performance database that covers sanctioned competition going back many years. I searched Sienna Whitmore. I found her ASU records, several 800 results between 2 and 3 minutes, none particularly notable, the last one dated 4 years prior. Nothing in the 1500, nothing post-collegiate. Then I searched the discretionary trials entry provision again, Section 4, Subsection C of the qualification document. The language specified that a coach seeking discretionary entry for an athlete had to demonstrate, among other things, a documented performance trajectory showing significant and sustained improvement over a minimum 12-month competitive window. 12 months. Sienna had been back in training for 6 months. She had run exactly one sanctioned 1500 result, the Phoenix Invitational Heat in February, which I had won. One result, in a minor regional meet. Against me, which she had lost, and yet, I did some digging into Coach G's professional relationships. He had been a USATF certified coach for over 2 decades. He sat on a regional coaching advisory committee that had informal but real influence over how selection criteria were interpreted and applied at the regional level. He had corresponded, this I found in a 2-year-old track and field news article about coaching development, with members of the National Selection Committee. He had credibility. He had history. He had access. The combination of all of this, Sienna's thin competitive record, her recent event switch, Coach G's position and relationships. The discretionary provision's subjectivity began to draw a shape I recognized. It was the shape of a plan, a long, careful, methodical plan, the kind of plan that a man who kept yellow legal pads and thought in 4-year cycles would make. He was going to build a case for his daughter on paper. Race results, workout logs, coaching certifications of readiness. He was going to use his credibility and connections to argue for a discretionary trials entry for Sienna Whitmore. And he was going to do it using resources, program funding, facility access, competition opportunities that by any fair metric should have been directed at me. The question was what to do about it. May was brutal in a different way. Physically, I was in the best shape of my life. The training was still good, I was still running, I was still showing up. Because stopping would have been surrender and I did not know how to surrender, but emotionally I was managing something very heavy. I had told Becca everything. I had told Darren the broad strokes. I had not told anyone else, and I had absolutely not told Coach G that anything was different between us. This required a particular kind of performance. Every morning at the facility, I showed up on time and worked hard and said the right things. I thanked Coach G for his feedback. I asked questions that indicated I was engaged and trusting. I smiled at Sienna. I helped her with cooldown drills when she asked. I was, and I say this not with pride but with the specific grim satisfaction of someone who learned to compete at a very young age, an excellent actress. Inside, I was building. Marguerite sent me a secure document sharing link and I uploaded everything I had, organized by date and category. Training inequality, resource allocation, competitive opportunity disparity, the MT. SAC evidence, Kyle's information about Sienna's ASU history, the performance database records, the qualification document with the relevant section highlighted. She reviewed it all and called me on a Tuesday evening. "This is better," she said, "substantially better. The event switch is significant. There's no documented reason on record for why she's competing in the 1500 instead of the 800. Which means the coaching decision to develop her as a 1500 runner appears to be strategic rather than performance-driven. Because the 1500 is where I am," I said. "Precisely, if the goal were her athletic development, you'd develop her in her existing event." A pause. "I've been in contact with the USATF Athlete Advocate Office, off the record, preliminary. They're aware that the discretionary provision has the potential for abuse. They've been watchful." "Watchful isn't the same as acting." "No," she agreed. "Which is why we're building something they can act on." She paused again. "There's one more thing I need. I need documentation that the program resources, specifically the grant funds, are being used in a way that a reasonable observer would identify as inequitable. Equipment, competition fees, access to specialist services, anything with a dollar amount attached." I thought about the Hoka spikes. The $280 Hoka Silo X1 spikes that Sienna had received in December, when I'd been told the equipment budget was limited. I had a text message from Coach G on my phone from November 19th that said, "In response to my equipment request, sorry Cass, tight on the budget end this quarter. Let's revisit in January." I had a screenshot of that text saved in a folder on my laptop. I told Marguerite, "That's the kind of thing," she said. That night I sat on my apartment floor with my foam roller and did my stretching sequence and thought about Gerald Whitmore. I thought about him the way you think about someone who has been part of your life for a very long time, not with simple anger, which would have been easier, but with something more complicated. He was a good coach. He was, I believed, a decent man who had done something that decent men sometimes do when love for their child exceeds their integrity. He had looked at the system he understood better than almost anyone and decided to use it. For her, I understood the impulse even as I could not forgive the action. But understanding it didn't change what I needed to do. June arrived with its long Arizona days and the smell of monsoon moisture gathering somewhere south of us, and the competition calendar began to fill up with summer meets. Coach G submitted entries for the USA Outdoor Track and Field Championships, the national championships, the significant one, the one where the people who mattered would be watching. He submitted one name in the women's 1500. It was mine. This surprised me until I thought about it carefully. Then it made a different kind of sense. He needed me to run nationals. My performance results were part of the program's grant justification, the grant that funded both of us, that funded Sienna's development. If he pulled me from nationals, the program's performance metrics took a hit. He needed me to run well to maintain the credibility of the operation. I was, in a sense, still useful to him. But I was useful the way a benchmark is useful, a baseline, a comparison point, a way of showing where Sienna was relative to a legitimate elite competitor. I decided to go to nationals and run the best race of my life. Not for him, not to prove anything to him, for me, because that's what I had always done. The USA Outdoor Championships were held in Eugene, Oregon, at Hayward Field, which is the cathedral of American track and field, the $270 million facility that Nike Money built. With its sweeping roof and its capacity crowds and its history going back to Prefontaine and the Oregon distance legacy. I had raced there once before as a wild card entry in the indoor championships 2 years earlier. Walking into Hayward feels like something. It is impossible to explain to someone who hasn't done it, but the size and the history of it press in on you in a way that is not intimidating so much as it is clarifying. You understand in that place why you have been doing what you've been doing. I ran a 4:02.1 in the semifinals. That time 4:02 1 is inside the World Athletics qualifying standard for the 2028 Olympics. 4:02:50 is the standard. I had just run faster than it in a semifinal at the national championships. I stood at the finish line with my hands on my knees and looked at the time on the board and felt something so large it had no name. 15 years. Every 5 a.m. morning. Every meal I didn't eat. Every social event I left early, every relationship I underprioritized, every choice I made in the direction of this instead of that. 4:02:1, I made the final. I finished 5th overall, not a podium, but against that field, against women who had multiple international appearances and professional training contracts. 5th was real. 5th was meaningful. Coach G shook my hand afterward. His grip was firm. He said, "Good race." 2 words. I said, "Thank you." 2 words back. Sienna hadn't traveled to Eugene. She was not at a level to compete there, and Coach G had not entered her. But when I got back to Flagstaff, I found out from Darren that while I was in Eugene, Coach G had submitted documentation to the USATF Athlete Services Office, not a formal discretionary entry application yet, but preliminary paperwork establishing Sienna as a candidate for consideration under Section 4C. The paperwork cited her improvement trajectory. It cited coaching assessment of competitive readiness. It cited as a program benchmark my own recent performance record. He was using my 4:02:1 to build her case. I sat in my car in the facility parking lot and read Darren's text and felt the specific, cold clarity of understanding something completely. Then I texted Marguerite. "He's begun the formal process. I have documentation of the preliminary filing. I have everything we discussed. I think it's time to talk about next steps." Her response came in 11 minutes. "I agree. Come in tomorrow, bring everything." The next morning was a Thursday in late June, warm and clear. The kind of Flagstaff summer day that makes you feel the altitude as a gift rather than a burden. I drove downtown to LaRue Street and parked and walked into the building with the exposed brick walls, and I sat across from Marguerite Flores, and together we began to plan. I had the time standard. I had the documentation. I had a lawyer who understood the system and a case that was, in her word, compelling. Now I needed to choose the right moment. And I needed to let Gerald Whitmore believe, until that moment arrived, that everything was exactly as he intended it to be. The moment arrived in October. Specifically, it arrived at the Mountain West Elite Showcase, a mid-sized regional meet held annually in Albuquerque, New Mexico, at the Albuquerque Convention Center track. It's not a glamorous venue, fluorescent overhead lighting, artificial track surface that runs slightly slow, bleachers that seat maybe 800 people. But it drew, this particular year, a meaningful audience. Several USATF regional officials, 2 members of the National Coaching Education Board, a journalist from Track and Field News who covered the women's middle distance circuit, and this was the critical piece. The piece that Marguerite had confirmed through the Athlete Services Network, a member of the Olympic Trials Selection Advisory Committee named Dr. Patricia Nguyen, who was there to observe and assess post-collegiate talent in advance of the qualification period. Coach G had entered Sienna in the women's 1500. He had entered me in the women's mile, a longer race, a different event, the kind of subtle maneuvering that would have been invisible to anyone who didn't already know what to look for. He had also, I discovered through Marguerite's contacts, submitted to the organizing committee a formal letter requesting that Sienna Whitmore's performance at the meet be officially evaluated under the USATF's discretionary entry criteria. He had CC'd Dr. Patricia Nguyen. He had arranged, in other words, for his daughter's audition, carefully, methodically, the way he always did things. I had submitted, through Marguerite, a formal request to the USATF Athlete Services Office the week before the meet. A comprehensive complaint alleging inequitable program resource allocation, misuse of development grant funding, and competitive opportunity manipulation. Marguerite had attached 31 pages of supporting documentation. She had also, through proper channels, notified Dr. Patricia Nguyen's office that the complaint existed and was under review. I had asked Marguerite, should I tell Coach G before the meet? Should I confront him? She had said with the calm of someone who had seen this kind of thing before, no, let him perform. Let him believe he has the stage. The prepared truth will land much harder in front of everyone than it will in a private conversation. I had trusted her. The same way I had once trusted Coach G, but this time with evidence. We drove to Albuquerque on a Friday morning in 2 vehicles, Coach G and Sienna in his truck, me and Darren in my car. Darren knew the broad strokes. He didn't know the specifics of the complaint, not all of them, but he knew enough to understand that something significant was going to happen and that his job was to stay nearby and be steady. How are you feeling? He asked somewhere around Soccer Row, the desert flat and golden on either side of the highway. Ready, I said, and I had been ready for months. The preparation, the documentation, the legal work, the conversations with Marguerite, the careful maintenance of my own training through all of it had been a second kind of race. Run in parallel to the first, and I was at the end of it now. We checked into the hotel on Friday afternoon. That evening, the organizing committee hosted a small athlete reception in the convention center lobby. Drink tables with sparkling water and orange juice, a few circular tables with chairs, the low ambient noise of people who run track professionally making small talk about splits and workout cycles. I saw Dr. Patricia Nguyen from across the room before anyone introduced us. She was in her mid-50s, trim, with close-cropped silver hair and the posture of someone who had run competitively herself once. She was talking to a USATF regional official. Coach G, I noticed, made his way to her within 15 minutes of arriving. He was smooth about it. He was always smooth. It was one of his gifts. He introduced himself, they shook hands, they talked for several minutes. He gestured at some point toward Sienna, who was standing nearby, and Dr. Nguyen nodded and looked at Sienna with the careful, professional interest of someone taking inventory. I stood across the room and watched and did not feel what I expected to feel. I expected anger. What I felt was something steadier. I had been here before, not literally in this room, but here in this emotional place, in the final minutes before a race. When the preparation is done, and the outcome is coming whether you are ready or not. You just have to run it. Darren handed me a glass of sparkling water. She's good, he said quietly, watching Dr. Nguyen. I know, I said, that's important. Saturday morning, race day. The women's 1500 was scheduled for 2:15 p.m. The women's mile was at 3:45. Coach G had arranged it so that he could be present for both, or so he thought. What he didn't know was that Marguerite Flores had arrived in Albuquerque the night before, and was sitting in the third row of the bleachers with a leather briefcase and a quiet, settled expression. What he didn't know was that Dr. Patricia Nguyen had received, via the USATF Athlete Services overnight courier, a copy of the formal complaint with a cover letter from the Athlete Advocate Office noting that it was under active review. What he didn't know was that the track and field news journalist, a woman named Sandy Kowalczyk, who had covered the women's middle distance circuit for 12 years and had received an anonymous tip from Darren's ASU contact, had been asking questions for 2 weeks and had a recorder in her jacket pocket. I had told Marguerite, I don't want to destroy him, I want the record corrected. I want what I've earned. She had said those things often require the same action. The 1500 went off at 2:15. Sienna was in lane 4. There were 6 other runners, a mix of post-collegiate club athletes and a couple of college seniors running for experience. The field was not deep. It was not a prestigious field. Sienna ran 4:10.2. It was, by her standards, a good race. She was in the lead group through 800 meters and held form reasonably well in the final 400. She finished third. Coach G was on the infield when she crossed the line. He walked over to her, put a hand on her shoulder, said something in her ear. She nodded. She looked satisfied. He then walked toward the officials' table where Dr. Nguyen was observing, and I watched him begin to speak. The pitch, the delivery, the careful assembly of the case he had been building for 12 months. I was too far away to hear the words. I didn't need to, I knew the shape of them. and then Marguerite appeared beside Dr. Nguyen. I had not orchestrated the moment exactly. Some things you cannot choreograph, you can only create the conditions for them, but Marguerite had been watching for the right opening, and this was it. She introduced herself quietly. She had a folder in her hand. She did not raise her voice or make a scene. She was, as she always was, precise and professional. I saw Coach G's expression change. It changed the way things change when you have been very certain of something and the certainty is suddenly removed, not all at once, but in stages. Like a structure settling after the ground shifts beneath it. He looked at Marguerite, he looked at the folder, he looked at Dr. Nguyen, whose expression had become professional and closed in the way that experienced officials' expressions become when something requires careful handling. He turned and looked for me. I was standing at the edge of the infield. I had been standing there the whole time. We looked at each other across that distance, across, really, 15 years, and I did not look away. I wasn't angry, I was just present. I was just there with everything I knew and everything I had documented and everything that was true, and he knew that I knew it, and the knowing was enough. Dr. Nguyen excused herself from the conversation. She moved away from Coach G and toward Marguerite, and they walked together toward the officials' corridor. Coach G stood alone at the edge of the infield. The 1500 results went up on the board. Third place, Sienna Whitmore, 4:10:2. My mile was in 90 minutes. I went to warm up. I ran a 4:22:1 in the mile. It was not a record. It was not my best effort. But it was clean and honest, and I ran it entirely on my own terms. And when I crossed the finish line and heard the small crowd in the bleachers and felt the familiar burn in my lungs, I thought, this is mine. This one is completely mine. Sandy Kowalczyk found me in the warm-up area during my cooldown. She had a notebook, not just a recorder. She introduced herself, told me she was writing a piece on development program oversight in post-collegiate track and field. She asked if I had any comment on the complaint filed with USATF regarding the Flagstaff Elite program. I looked at her. I thought about Marguerite's advice, let the process work. Don't get ahead of it. I'd refer you to my legal representative, I said. I gave her Marguerite's card. She thanked me and walked away. I finished my cooldown and stretched on the infield grass and listened to the sound of the facility around me, the chatter, the announcer's voice. The starting gun for another heat, and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not relief, not victory, something quieter, the feeling of having done a hard thing correctly. The fallout was not instantaneous. These things never are. Marguerite's formal complaint was received by the USATF Athlete Services Office and assigned to an investigative committee within the week. The investigation was, by the standards of sports governance, reasonably swift. 3 months, during which a program auditor reviewed the Flagstaff Elite grant expenditures, interviewed Darren and Priya as corroborating witnesses, examined Coach G's competition entry documentation, and assessed the training log records I had provided. The findings, issued in a formal letter to all parties in January, were careful and institutional in language but clear in substance. The Flagstaff Elite program had demonstrated a pattern of resource allocation inconsistent with merit-based program principles as required by the USATF development grant terms. The preliminary Section 4C discretionary application for Sienna Whitmore was withdrawn from consideration pending further review. The program's grant funding was placed under a 60-day compliance review. Coach G was not removed from his certification. He was censured, formally reprimanded on the record, which in coaching circles means something real. The censure was included in his official USATF coach profile. Sandy Kowalczyk's article ran in Track and Field News in February. It was measured and factual and attributed. She interviewed Dr. Nguyen on the record about the selection process's vulnerability to coaching relationships. She interviewed Marguerite on the legal dimensions. She did not editorialize beyond what the facts already said clearly. Coach G called me 3 weeks after the article ran. I let it go to voicemail. He left a message that was, in its way, as careful as everything he had ever done. He said he had not intended to harm me. He said he had believed, genuinely, that Sienna was capable. He said he regretted that things had reached this point. He said he hoped I would continue my career. He did not say I was wrong. He did not say I'm sorry for what I took from you. I listened to the voicemail twice, then I deleted it. The hardest conversation was not with Coach G, it was with Sienna. She called me in March, about 2 months after everything became public. I was surprised she called. I almost didn't answer. But something, some residual sense of fairness maybe, or just curiosity, made me pick up. I need you to know, she said without preamble, that I didn't know, not the extent of it. I sat with that for a moment. What did you know? A silence. Then, I knew he wanted to help me. I knew he thought I could do it. I didn't ask him how he was making it happen. Okay, I said, that's not an excuse. I know it's not. I know it's not either. Another silence. She said, are you going to be okay for the trials? And this was the strange human part of it. She was asking me genuinely if I was going to be okay. Her voice had the texture of actual concern, and I believed it, the same way I believed that she probably had not known the full shape of what her father was doing. People do not always know what is being done on their behalf. That doesn't make them innocent, exactly, but it makes them something more complicated than a villain. I'm going to be more than okay, I said. I qualified the standard last summer. I know, she said. I saw. What about you? I asked, surprising myself. I don't know yet. Her voice was quiet. I think I need to figure out if this is actually what I want, not what my dad wanted, what I want. That seemed honest. I respected the honesty even if it came late. Good luck with that, I said, and I meant it, and we hung up. I found a new coach in February. Her name is Diana Park, and she is based in Portland, Oregon, and she has coached 3 Olympians in the 1500, one of whom won a bronze in Tokyo. She is 39, spare with words in a different way than Coach G was spare, not authoritative silence but focused efficiency. She doesn't keep yellow legal pads. She uses a coaching app on her phone and sends me voice notes and communicates in the kind of direct, performance-centered language that I find I have been hungry for without knowing it. She watched my Eugene footage and the Albuquerque mile and said, "Your kick is your weapon. We've been burying it in patience. In the trials, you go with 500 to go. My old coach always said 800, I said. Your old coach, she said evenly, had other priorities. I moved to Portland in March. It rains there constantly, a gray persistent softness that is nothing like Arizona, and I am still getting used to it, the way the moisture sits in your lungs differently. The way the trails along the Columbia River smell of cedar and wet earth instead of pine and red rock. I miss Flagstaff. I think I will always miss it, but I needed to start from a new place, and Portland is a good place to start from. Becca visited in April. We ran together on a Sunday morning, easy, conversational pace, the kind of run I almost never let myself take, and she said, partway through, "So are you happy?" I thought about it. The question felt like something that needed honest handling. I'm not happy the way people are happy in movies, I said, like I don't feel rescued. I feel like I ran a very hard race and I'm still running and the finish line is a year away. That sounds like you, she said. I know, but you're good. Yeah, I said, I'm good. And I was. I am, in the way that matters, the bone-deep, daily practice way, the way that doesn't require anyone else's confirmation. I know what I am. I know what I have done and what was done to me and what I did in response to what was done to me. The record is clear. The record is mine. The trials are in 14 months. The venue is Los Angeles at the rebuilt Memorial Coliseum, and there is something almost unbearable in the symmetry of it, the city where the Olympics are coming. The track where American history will happen, the place where, if everything I have been building for 26 years coheres in a single race, I will earn the right to call myself an Olympian. I run every morning. My alarm goes off at 5 a.m. and I lie there for exactly 3 seconds. I have always allowed myself those 3 seconds, and then I get up. I lace my shoes. I go out into the Portland rain or the Portland sun, depending on the day, and I run. I think about a lot of things on those morning runs. I think about Flagstaff. I think about my mother and her junior joggers club and the girl who ran that first invitational and surprised everyone. I think about Diana Park's voice notes arriving on my phone with the next week's training plan, precise and purposeful. I think about the yellow legal pad, which I have not forgiven but have begun to understand as simply an object that a flawed person used badly. No different from any other object that flawed people use badly. I don't think about Gerald Whitmore as much as I expected to. The space he occupied in my mental architecture has been, over these months, gradually replaced by something else, not by another person. Just by the work itself. By the daily accumulation of miles and data and faith in my own body that I have been building since I was 9 years old and will keep building until there is nothing left to build. There is a quote, I don't know who said it, I've heard it attributed to various people over the years, about how the truth doesn't announce itself, it just accumulates. You keep doing the work, keep the record honest, and eventually the record speaks for itself. I believe that. I have staked my career on it. On a morning last week, near the end of a long run along the river, I felt my legs find their rhythm in that particular way, the way that comes only after many miles. When your body stops negotiating and just goes, and I thought, there it is. That's the thing that has never been taken from me and cannot be. 14 months. I'll be ready. The moral of a story, if it has one, is rarely in the dramatic moment. It's in the morning after the dramatic moment, when you have to decide who you're going to be now that the thing is done. I had spent so long preparing for the confrontation that I hadn't fully prepared for the quiet that came after it. But quiet, I've learned, is not absence. It's the sound of having done the work and being able to rest in it at least for a moment before the next part begins. The next part always begins. I am 26 years old, I still have time.